Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar featuring Thurston Clark. He's the author of Honorable Exit: How a Few Brave Americans Risked All to Save Our Vietnamese Allies at the End of the War. Joining him in the conversation will be Jay Young. I want to especially welcome customers of Interabang Books. As many of you know who've been watching these webinars, we have a special relationship with Interabang Books, and they are offering free shipping. So all you need to do is go to interabangbooks.com, order Thurston's book, which just came out in paperback just a few days ago, and it'll be shipped out just as quickly as possible, as are all of the books that are featured here at the World Affairs Council. Let me just take a second to mention something else. You've heard me thank some of the people who have supported these Zoomcasts, and we're so appreciative to them. These are challenging times for the World Affairs Council, as they are for you and so many other organizations and stores. And if you are able and would like to support the World Affairs Council, our general operations, or particularly these Zoomcasts, just go to dfwworld.org/donate. We certainly would appreciate it. And if you'd like to talk with me about a specific gift, just go ahead and send me an email at jfalk@dfwworld.org. We certainly appreciate your help. So let's get back to the webinar. So if you'd like to ask questions, just go to the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, and you can submit your questions there, and you can also one-up. So if you see a question that you think particularly deserves mention, go ahead and just do that thumbs up, and it'll go to the top of the list. We ask that you keep your questions succinct, so that Jay Young can read them, and he'll get to just as many as he can. We ask that there'll be no conversations or comments there. So let me tell you a little bit about Thurston Clark. He is the author of 13 fiction and nonfiction books of historical nature as well as travel. This latest book came out in hardcover just about a year ago, and as I said, the paperback edition just came out just a few days as well. Jay Young is a director of our World Affairs Council here in Dallas. He also just recently retired after a very distinguished career with the Naval Reserves. I think Jay served almost over 20 years, and he retired as a captain, and he had particular responsibility for 2 intelligence units. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us, and I look forward to hearing and watching your conversation.
Jim, thank you, sir. Appreciate the intro. And Thurston, again, welcome, at least virtually, to Dallas-Fort Worth and the World Affairs Council. We're really glad you're here. What I'd like to start with, Thurston, is some of us who are, as I said, a certain age can remember seeing some of the events that you describe in this book on television. I was a junior in high school when these things happened. Could you maybe start by providing a brief overview of what this book is about and the kind of events and the scope of what happened during the course of March and April 1975 here?
Sure. I have to go back to the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. This was supposed to be the peace agreement that was going to bring the United States peace with honor. As a condition of it, we took out all of our troops from South Vietnam, all of our uniformed troops, except for 50. And in exchange, we got all of our POWs back from North Vietnam, including, of course, John McCain. And the problem with the peace accord was that it allowed the communists, the North Vietnamese, to keep 100,000 troops in places inside South Vietnam. And this was a kind of poison pill that finally had a terrible effect about 2 years later, because the communists then started really an all-out offensive in the Central Highlands. In March. There had been some probes and some other clashes in January, and they quickly overcame the South Vietnamese forces, particularly in the north around Da Nang, And so it unraveled very, very quickly in South Vietnam. As early as, mid-March, my book really talks about the events of mid-March to the end of April, which is when all pretense of the peace accords being honored by the North Vietnamese and by the communists within South Vietnam were completely ended. And they were in an all-out war at that point, and the South Vietnamese army collapsed very quickly in the north. At this point, there were about 7,000 Americans living in South Vietnam. Some were with the State Department and with the Central Intelligence Agency, and a lot of them were contractors, which were private American citizens. We know about the use of contractors now in Afghanistan and Iraq. And a number of them were Army and Navy veterans who in many cases had married Vietnamese women and had considered themselves residents of South Vietnam, and also considered the families of their wives to be their families, of course. And that went on beyond in-laws and their children, because as people are aware, people who know the Vietnamese, family, there's no such thing as a nuclear family. The family includes aunts and uncles and grandparents and on, and most of these families have 25 or 30 people. And so these Americans were very reluctant to leave with just their nuclear families. And of course, the American government, was President Ford then, and Henry Kissinger was both Secretary of State and was Ford's advisor in the White House, National Security Advisor. They wanted to get these Americans out, but the Americans wouldn't leave. So they had to devise some way to get them to leave. And this is one of the threads in my story. The other thread is that there had been so many Americans who had worked in South Vietnam over the course of our involvement in the war there, that they had forged very strong friendships and relationships with the Vietnamese people. And they weren't about to see them abandoned.
That's a huge point, and I want to come back to that.
Yeah.
But talk a little bit about the scope and scale of this evacuation. You mentioned at one point it's the largest evacuation since Dunkirk, which I found an amazing comparison. How many people were brought out? How big an effort really was this?
Yeah. Well, 130,000 is the official figure. That's 130,000 people. And that's 130,000 Vietnamese and Cambodians. You have to add another 7,000 or 8,000 Americans and third country nationals to that. So that's 130,000 people who were evacuated basically within a 6-week period.
Right.
And they all had to be either go out by sea or they had to be flown out. Because unlike the situation that we have now in a country like Afghanistan or Iraq, there are no land borders that these people could cross. They couldn't go into Cambodia. Cambodia had just fallen to the Khmer Rouge, and there was a terrible genocide that had started there in the middle of April. News of that quickly spread through South Vietnam. They couldn't go north because that was North Vietnam with the communists. So the only way they could get out was by air or by sea. And so the evacuation started on a very slow basis of Americans smuggling Vietnamese friends and people onto the transport planes that were going back empty to the Philippines. These were U.S. Air Force planes that had brought in supplies. They were going to go back. And so, and you have to realize when that happened, the commander, the U.S. military attaché, Major General Homer Smith, who was the senior military officer in South Vietnam, he knew what was happening, but he looked the other way. He didn't do anything to stop it. And there was a kind of already a conspiracy of silence among the military personnel at Tan Son Nhut, the Air Force base in Saigon, to have this kind of slow motion evacuation take place. And that's the beginning of my story. And then, of course, we can talk about this more. It suddenly accelerates.
Well, one of the things that amazed me, and always seems to be a theme when you look at Vietnam in particular, I'm a former intelligence officer, is the difference between the assessment of people on the ground about what the nature of the crisis was and how accurate they were about how things were, how fast things were collapsing. And then, of course, this, even in the embassy in Saigon, much less in Washington, people were either denying reality or didn't want to deal with it. How did that affect the progress and the effectiveness of the evacuation?
What it meant was that a lot of people who should have gotten out, a lot of South Vietnamese who should have gotten out, didn't get out. And that there should have been something mounted much sooner. I mean, there are so many cases in my book of people, Americans who were in intelligence or in the State Department,
Right.
who knew Vietnamese, who spoke Vietnamese, who knew the country, and knew that the end was there. I mean, that it was a matter of weeks and not months or years before we were going to be kicked out. One of my favorite ones is Terry Tull, who was the acting U.S. Consul General in Da Nang and was very close to the military, South Vietnamese military commander at the time. And she wrote a cable to Graham Martin, who was the ambassador in Saigon, and also copy that went to the State Department, saying that it was over, basically, that the North was going to fall and we better get our people out, get our Americans out, but also get the Vietnamese interpreters, translators, the kind of people whose lives are threatened in Iraq and Afghanistan by their association with us, of these people, or who were, they were on communist death lists.
So talk a little bit.
Yeah, she was risking her career when she sent this off. She said to her secretary, this could be the end of my career.
Well, I want to, and folks, I'm starting to get a couple of questions, so please do send us some and we'll work them in. Talk a little bit, if you would, Thurston, about some of these Americans and why, you mentioned this a little bit up front, why were they so determined to risk everything to go in and help these people? Was it a function of just how long they've been there, how much they gotten to love? I mean, a lot of times you talk about how much they love the country. Did some of them see what was happening early? One of the questions that we had come in and try to get out before the evacuations even began. Talk a little bit about that level of depth of concern and even love for the country that motivated this.
You had a long time, and this had gone on for the real fighting part of the war, with the combat troops coming in under President Johnson's orders, 1965. So for 10 years, you have Americans, particularly American Vietnamese experts, who had been cycling in and out of the country. And once the 1973 started, and you had a lot of civilians there who were American Foreign Service officers and people and Central Intelligence Agencies, these tended to be people who liked the country. They wanted to be there. They volunteered to come back. And there was also the fact that the Vietnamese culture and people are much more open to mixing with foreigners. And a lot of this, of course, the same thing happened under the French. 15% of the country was Catholic. There was the history, as I said, of interacting with European people. There'd been intermarriage, a lot of it with the French as well. Also, a lot of the American people who came back as Foreign Service officers, Central Intelligence Agency people, as well as the military who were in plain clothes and the NSA, they believed in this military code of honor that you don't leave your allies behind on the battlefield, that it's not done. It's dishonorable. And again, and this is why I use the word about honorable exit, people kept talking about it would be dishonorable to leave them behind, and that they were trying to do the honorable thing. And I found a tremendous self-awareness among the people I interviewed. And these were both interviews that they gave me, but also things they said at the time, which is they realized they were looking ahead. And they didn't want to 10, 20 years ago to look back and say, I abandoned these people, I did something cowardly. They knew that they would be holding themselves to account for how they behaved during these weeks, these final weeks in Vietnam.
You mentioned earlier Terry Tall, who was one of the senior female, senior female
Yeah.
members of foreign service in Vietnam, and her, her role. Are there other individuals that really stood out, and you describe a large number of them in terms of what they did and how they did it? Just mention a couple of them that really kind of struck you. And
Sure, sure. Well, there was the Terry Mcnamara, who was the consul general in Canton, which was the largest city in the Delta. And he looked around. He had been in and out of Vietnam for years. I mean, he'd been the first consul general in Da Nang, and he knew the country. He spoke Vietnamese. He, in the middle of March, when things began to come apart in the north, he got his people, the staff together, Americans, and said, we've got to get our Vietnamese out. And he had them divide their Vietnamese personnel into A, B, and C categories. A were people who were going to suffer, probably be on communist death lists. These were people who cooperated with the Central Intelligence officers, people who worked at the embassy, and people who spoke good English and were going to be able to make it in the United States. The next were the B categories, and these were people who were less at risk, but had certain skills that meant they were probably going to be all right. C were people who didn't speak any English, were people who were maids, cleaners, drivers, and they would try to take them out if they could, but if they didn't have the room, these were the people they were going to leave behind. Anyway, he figured out there were so many people he wasn't going to get the planes or anything else. So through a whole bunch of finagling and undercover operation, he managed to get his hands on a couple of huge barges that had been taking ammunition up to Cambodia. But each one of these barges could take a couple hundred people. And so he told the embassy that he was going to do this. And the man at the embassy, who was not Graham Martin, but who was the ambassador, a guy called Jake Jacobson, who was a military man with a lot of experience, thought it was crazy. And the Central Intelligence people in Canton didn't want to go on his barges. They wanted to be flown out on helicopters because they said that a lot of the riverbanks were controlled by communists. They were going to be shot at, and that nobody knew how to. Mcnamara didn't have anybody who knew how to navigate the river. And that they said, well, we're going to be, if we're taken by the communists, the Central Intelligence agent, the officers, we don't have a cover story. They're going to, kill us. Anyway, so there was a lot of to and fro, and finally Mcnamara held out. And the last day, he went to about a week before. He went to Saigon and was told that he couldn't do this, and that he would be ordered to take just the Americans out by helicopter. And he said, I won't go for that. I'm not going to do it. Full stop. And in the end, he got out, and he got out.
Yeah. So we have a question that asks, where did these families and where did these people go when they were taken out of the country? Did they, what locations did they go to? I assume most, if not all of them, ultimately ended up in the United States, but how was it determined where they went and why did they go there?
They went most of them went to the Philippines and Guam. They went to the American, the air base in the Philippines, the naval base in the American naval base in the Philippines, and they were flown to Guam. In the final days, a few were flown directly to Wake Island. From there, they were all flown to the United States, and there were 6 resettlement camps in the United States throughout the country. One in California, there was one in Pennsylvania, there was one in Arkansas. I think there was one in Texas as well. And from there, the State Department, the AID, and also a lot of private organizations, non-governmental organizations, resettled them throughout the United States. And there were, I think, originally of the 130 odd who went to these camps, got to these places, and they got there by May or June of 1975. By December of 1975, there were only 10,000 people left in these camps.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
All the rest had gone on to been scattered across the country. Now, eventually, because the Vietnamese, they like to get together. They're most of them ended up being in Texas, in California, in Virginia, Northern Virginia, in Florida, and places. But they were spread out, and it was a tremendously successful. And it's an enormous thing to think about it now. The country took 130,000 people and absorbed them and gave them all American citizenship.
Well, I want to come back to that because you mentioned in a couple of cases what happens to some of these people, and I want to, after they get here, some of the subsequent careers they and their children have. But I want to go back a little bit to the and folks still shoot us some more questions. I've got a couple in the queue I'm going to come to, but please don't hesitate to send us more. I want to come back to some of the aspects of the crisis itself. Talk a little bit about Ambassador Graham Martin. I mean, he is a central figure in the book and a really complex individual on many levels. What were his motivations? And you're seeing a picture of him now. Talk a little bit about his motivations. What was he trying to achieve? Because on the one hand, he looked very obstructionist, but then he seemed toward the end to be, much more in favor of, moving people out. What was he?
You're right. He's really a tragic figure, and also someone who, at the end, it proved that his heart was in the right place, but he was terribly misguided and confused about what was going on. Just to move back a bit, he was a very had a reputation of being quite a difficult man. He'd had a brilliant foreign service career. He had served as ambassador to Italy before he had come to South Vietnam. Before that, he'd been ambassador in Thailand. And there, he had been opposed to in having American combat troops come in to help the Thais against counterinsurgency. And Mcnamara, the Secretary of Defense, and Dean Rusk were so upset with him that he was essentially pulled out of Thailand and recalled from there because of the cables he sent, which were sharply worded cables. And then he ended up in Italy. He was a kind of liberal, one of the neoliberal anti-communists.
Right.
His heroes, one of his heroes was Adlai Stevenson.
Right.
And here he is, now put in Italy by Richard Nixon. And why was he ambassador to Italy? What happened? And this shows how cagey and what a clever bureaucratic character he was. He was Nixon came as a private citizen to Thailand while he was ambassador with Hubert Humphrey, when Humphrey was vice president. And at one point, there was a time to give a toast, and Humphrey stood up to give a toast to the king of Thailand, and Martin said, "No." He said, "I'm the senior American official here. It's my part to give the toast." So he made Humphrey sit down. He gave the toast, and afterwards he turned to Nixon, and he said, I would protect along the lines of, I would protect, the prerogatives, of any, American president or vice president. This is what I'm about. Nixon never forgot it. And as soon as he became elected president, he had somebody call Martin and say, the president would like to make you an ambassador somewhere. Where would you like to go? And Martin said, Italy, Rome. And the guy said, well, that's usually for a very important donor or something. Can you think of something else? And Martin said, Rome. And they called him back a week later, and he said, no, I couldn't think of anything in Rome. And so he got Rome, and he went there as a career. Anyway, this gives you an idea of the kind of person that he was. He was convinced that, that the communists did not want to invade take Saigon because it would make them
Right.
look bad. They destroy the city, there'd be a lot of deaths. He thought they're going to stay outside of Saigon and they're going to want to negotiate. And they're going to want to negotiate with me, with Graham Martin.
Good Lord.
Yeah, he's going to be doing, and he believed this until the last day, and was also encouraged to believe this by Kissinger, who had been bamboozled by the communists into believing that they
Yes.
weren't going to take Saigon.
It was an active disinformation campaign, wasn't it?
It was absolutely active and completely successful.
Yeah.
And so Martin kept holding out and believing that it wasn't going to happen, that the communists, yes, they are at the gates of Saigon, but now we're going to negotiate and there'll be a coalition government. And yes, the communists will eventually take over, but it'll be a slow motion kind of coup. It'll take a couple of years. And therefore, any of the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese who want to get out, they're going to have plenty of time to get out. Why do we have to take them out now? If we take them out now, it's going to panic the army. It's going to panic the government. And so that was his take. And he had been fooled, as Kissinger was fooled, by the communists. In fact, I tell a story in the book. The head of the CIA, Thomas Polgar, also bought into this.
Yeah, station chief.
The station chief, Polgar, believed this. And about 3 or 4 days before the end, Tom Glenn, who was the head of the top NSA, National Security Agency, officer there, who had been predicting a communist takeover for 6 weeks or 7 weeks, but no one had listened to him, goes into Graham Martin and says, this is it. They're going to, we got to get everybody out. They're going to be here in less than a week. And Martin puts his arm around him and says, young man, when you get to be older, as old as I am, and have as much experience, you'll understand these things better. Glenn was 38 or something. So then he goes down to Polgar. He scurries down the office to Polgar's office, the CIA station chief, and he says, almost like he could shake him and say, you got to do something because Martin is not listening to me. And Polgar looks at him and says, listen, I'll bet you a bottle of champagne. You can choose the vintage, but you and I will both be here in the embassy a year from now.
Oh, that's a really bad bet.
That was a terrible bet. So anyway, so that gives you an idea of, Martin was just terrified that the whole thing would come up to pieces and that Americans wouldn't get out because the South Vietnamese.
He'd be blamed for it.
And he had some cause. And then when the end finally came, when he had the people in the embassy that he had to get out, 2,000 people, Vietnamese, and he promised to take them out. That's when his heroism kicked in those final hours.
Well, let's go back for a minute. We have an interesting question from one of our listeners about the individuals that were involved in taking these people out. Were there any professional repercussions for the diplomats and military folks that kind of risked it all to get people out? Did anything happen to them afterwards?
No, because it was widely recognized at the end that they had done the right thing. Okay. I can illustrate this. It's a great story that illustrates this. There were these 2 American Foreign Service officers, Craig Johnstone and Lionel Rosenblatt, who had had extensive experience in South Vietnam. They were both desk officers at the State Department. They asked permission to go back about 2 weeks beforehand to take a vacation and go back and help their people get on these evacuation planes. And they were told, no, you can't go. The State Department is not letting anybody go in, any of our people go into South Vietnam because we're just going to have to evacuate them. So they disobeyed. And they got their regular passports, not their State Department passports. They bought their own tickets. They flew into Saigon on the 22nd, about 8 days before the end, bought tickets on Pan Am, got on the last plane, arrived, set up an underground thing, wore disguises, met people in the cathedral and in the post office, set up an immediate underground railway, forged papers, got their people out to Tontanut, got 300 people out. And at the time, the State Department security people and Martin had been ordered to find them and arrest them and take them out of the country immediately. And they'd even notified the South Vietnamese police, which could have been very tough for them because they could have ended up under arrest in a jail when the communists moved in. Anyway, about 2 weeks later, there's a story about what they've done in the paper. And Lawrence Eagleburger, who is one of Kissinger's, calls them, says Kissinger wants to see you about this. And so they come in to Kissinger's office, and Eagleburger says, listen, don't say anything, just take your medicine. He's going to be very upset with you. So they come into Kissinger's office. Kissinger says, what you did, I'm trying to have a foreign service that's disciplined, and you guys just went off on your own and did all this. And then he turns to Eagleburger, and then he turns to them and he said, but you did the right thing. And if more people had acted the way you had, we would have had a much better, evacuation. And then he turns to Eagleburger and he says, if I get any more people like this, people who've done the right thing, send in to me. He said, it's you who are going to be disciplined. And then at the end, he says, he says to them both, where do you want to go? What would be your dream posting? And they each tell him where they would like to go next, and he sends them there.
That's really interesting. The fact that there were no repercussions because people did recognize that they had done a good job is extremely. I was curious. A lot of in the book you talk, this also is a reflection on the questions we have. Did any of our allies, help in any way? The French, of course, had a long-standing relationship. I think you mentioned at one point, however, that the French ambassador evacuated his mistress before he evacuated his wife, which I thought was. But what was? I mean, and I think we evacuated some South Koreans or tried to. What role did any of our allies play in any of this, good or bad?
Well. The French weren't fighting with us in South Vietnam. I mean, they were kind of an ally at times. Their citizens all put French flags out all over their houses. And in fact, a couple of days before the end, suddenly there was the tricolor was flying above French villas, and that was also a bad sign, as was the French ambassador evacuating his mistress. A lot of the French did leave. The other European countries, some of the other allies, the British basically abandoned their people.
Yes, I remember that. That was amazing.
Yeah.
Just left them,
And the Canadians did the same thing. Of course, they hadn't fought. They hadn't had the same relationship with the Vietnamese that we had, but they did have employees at their embassy and people. And most of them didn't. And most of them didn't look after the Philippines government did try to take its people out, and they sent a boat to Vung Tau, which is the seaport closest to Saigon, to bring out the Filipinos who had worked as mechanics for Air America, which is the CIA-controlled airline. Not the mechanics themselves, but their wives and families. And they did. They brought them. They took them out, and they also took some Vietnamese out as well.
So two questions in the aftermath of the fall of Saigon. You mentioned a few cases, where some of these people were put into, long-term re-education, to use the term, camps and things. Tell us a little bit about what happened to a lot of these Vietnamese folks that didn't get out. Did most of them go to prison? And also, did any Americans not make it out? Were there any that were left behind?
No, there were. There were three or four who were left. I think it was four who were left behind. One was in the embassy and didn't get out. There were 400 people who didn't make it out of the embassy compound, and he was one of them. And they finally came home. We had an exchange, and the communists sent them to Thailand, and they came back from Thailand. But I think it was about 4 months later, or 5 months, not a year later. It was about 4 or 5 months later. There was an former American Central Intelligence officer who went in to try to bring his wife and family out, and he was apprehended and executed by the communists.
Oh, wow.
But as far as the South Vietnamese who stayed, there were these concentration camps called re-education camps, and some people were in them for as long as 18 years. The other problem that happened is that the families of military officers and government officials in the South Vietnamese army, they couldn't get jobs. A lot of them couldn't get jobs. They didn't get, they were at the bottom of the line for getting food rations, and there was a terrible food shortage for the first couple of years of the communist regime, which is one of the things that pushed a lot of the boat people out to leave. So the number of people who died in the re-education camp is disputed. I mean, I've heard 65,000, 100,000, 185,000, but there was a lot of mistreatment. They were work camps. The medical care was poor to non-existent. There was food rations were almost starvation diet. And a lot of them left. They were told originally that they were going for a month and to bring enough food for a month, and then they would all be coming home. And that's what their families believed. And that's how they got them to just voluntarily volunteer to and be marched off to these places. And as I said, the 18 years was the longest. I mean, but a lot of them were in there for multiple years. And the ones that survived and came out didn't have work. They couldn't get jobs. You know, it was not the bloodbath that was forecast by some.
Yeah, that you saw in Cambodia. Yeah, it didn't happen the same way.
Not a Cambodia situation. Yeah. Some people have called it a slow motion, killing.
Right.
It was the result. And there were no doubt there were summary executions that happened in the weeks after. Again, it's disputed whether it was a few dozen, a few hundred, or a few thousand, and the figures are very hard to.
One question that came in that's interesting. I had the same thought. Did you talk to Frank Snepp at all, the fellow who wrote the book Decent Interval? And
yeah, I made a couple of attempts to get to him, and it didn't work out. And my feeling was that his book is 500 pages long, and
yeah, it's a long. I've read it years ago. It's a long book.
And it was done right after the evacuation,
and without agency approval.
Yeah, and I found very useful a book by Butler. I've forgotten his first name, who was an NBC correspondent, who 10 years later interviewed a lot of people. And a lot of them had since died, and his interviews were available. He's passed away, but his interviews were available in his papers at Dartmouth. And I found those interviews would be extremely helpful. And most of I did 40 or 50 original interviews, in a lot of them in the Washington, D.C. area, because a lot of the military and State Department and intelligence officers have all retired into that area. Some still work in the Pentagon. So I was able to get to a lot of people that way.
Right. One of our listeners asked about a book by Viet Thanh Nguyen, a book called The Sympathizer, which tells the story about the fall of the South Vietnamese. In kind of a different perspective from somebody there who was the Vietnamese. How, did you notice that, or was that an interesting?
I did. I read that quite a few, when it first came out, but I was impressed by it, and by then I think I had pretty much finished my research, and it was fiction, of course, and
right.
See, I had a thing. I interviewed. The story kind of concentrates on the Americans who are
an American focus story.
Have some Vietnamese in the end who got their own people out, there were some heroic Vietnamese, one of them particularly, Lem Truong, who was the highest ranking woman in the South Vietnamese government. And I tell her story at the end. And she, of course, is in the United States. And as has Jackie Bong Wright, who is in the book as well, who was lives in Virginia and got out on the 75th. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about Henry Kissinger, a little more about Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford's role. I mean, from what I could tell, Gerald Ford was, when he was presented with what was going on, became very aggressive about saying, let's get these people out. Kissinger was, a little more evasive and perhaps politically motivated at times, but Ford seemed fairly determined to get a lot of these folks out. How did their roles play into the conduct of the?
He was determined to get them out, particularly in their case. There were still these thousands of Americans that they had to get out. They didn't want to leave behind as hostages, and then they realized that to get them out, they were going to have to take 20 or 30 Vietnamese members of their family. And finally, Homer Smith, who was the military officer there, devised this ruse, really, where they could sign an affidavit saying these are any American in South Vietnam could sign an affidavit and say these are members of my family, and that way they could get on a plane. They could get manifested on one of the Air Force planes, and they'd be gone. Now, that was misused in a wonderfully creative way, and the Vietnamese would show up with 10 or 15, Americans would show up 10 or 15 Vietnamese, some of them much older than them, claiming that these were their adopted sons and daughters.
Exactly.
And the State Department, the Ken Moorfield, who was one of the heroes of the book, who was the State Department officer at the Ton Xinu processing people, just simply, stamped the papers and looked the other way. And at one point, a nun came with to take out 80 Amerasian children, and he said, "I can't do that because the South Vietnamese will shut us down. They were very sensitive about losing their children." And so he said, "Go back and put them together in families with some of the other nuns and some of the administrators, bring them back to me, and then I'll process them." And that's what he did. You have to realize the people who were the most negative about this were the senators and congressmen in Congress, because the American people were sick of the
Yes,
Vietnam
that was a
War.
key point.
And it was a terrible time. It was 9% unemployment. And there was inflation, and there was a recession going on. They didn't want all these people. And so there was a lot of pushback against Ford. There was a meeting, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee came, and they said flatly, what about the Americans? We'll give you money to get Americans out. The only way we're going to give you money to get Vietnamese out is if that's a kind of bribe that we have to pay so that the Americans can come out. In other words, if we have to take a certain number of Vietnamese to get the Americans out safely, fine. But there was no talk about our moral responsibility to them, or they've been our ally, what could happen to them. And in fact, as I point out in the book, 2 or 3 days after the fall of Saigon, Senator George McGovern, who had been the anti-war candidate in 1972, said that 90% of the people who come over here, the Vietnamese, would be better off back in Vietnam, and we should repatriate them.
Well, that's a good segue into it. Folks, if you've got any questions, additional questions, please don't hesitate to send them in using the Q&A button down there. That's a good segue into the next question. I mean, how did they settle in, and the community itself seems to have integrated relatively well. How did some of these folks actually fare? What did they do when they got to the United States?
They've turned out to be one of the most, if not the most successful recent immigrant communities that we've had.
That was my perception.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to realize this, they were the final people who were evacuated. Yes, there were bar girls, there were maids, there were all kinds of people who probably weren't at risk, who got on the planes in the confusion and the fact that, as I just said, people were stamping the papers and sending them through. So but a large majority of the people came out were civil servants, military, educated people, spoke English, had skills, and so they did very well here. There were doctors, there were lawyers, there were graduate students. So it was a very highly educated group of people in the main. And the other ones have done well too. Most of them have done very well. I mean, we've all read the stories about, there have been some Vietnamese gangs in the Los Angeles area and things, but by and part, the Vietnamese have become incredibly successful immigrant group in this country.
There's an interesting question from one of our listeners about who is an English as a second language teacher here. And she asked, she's found similarities between her Vietnamese students and who she's taught, and current Afghan students, and suggests that it's due to the U.S. military involvement in their home countries. There are lessons learned or observations that you can offer about folks like this who are coming in as refugees, to educators, or more generally to us when we're thinking about these situations where refugees might be coming into the country.
Yeah, just step back for a minute. I got the idea for this book because a guy who was the best friend of my daughters in our local high school here went to college and then went into the Army. He's now a captain in intelligence, in military intelligence, and he had a tour in Iraq. And when he came back, he told me that he was just appalled at at how difficult it was to get his interpreter and his Iraqi civilians who had worked with him, and how to get them out. And he felt they were at great risk. Now, there is a program, but it's slow moving. It's very hard. It takes a long time. And so that made me think about, that reminded me of the Vietnam situation. And I had some memory that we took a number of Vietnamese out, but I had no idea how many. And that led me into investigating what had happened with the Vietnamese. So I went from the Afghanistan thing. I'm sure that would be a lot of success stories, because of course a lot of the Afghans that we're dealing with who are counterparts in the government, counterparts of the State Department people and everything else. Again, you're talking about people who have an education.
Right.
And it would probably add a lot to this country.
Yeah, somewhat similar to the exodus of the Cuban middle class from Castro's regime. A lot of those folks were middle class, even upper class in some cases. Interesting question about, again, getting back to the people that were left behind. Well, do you have any sense as to what life was like for the Asian children that were left behind, the children of Vietnamese women and U.S. soldiers?
Well, it's supposedly very, 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 very hard, very difficult.
Yeah, that was my impression.
Because they were visual reminders of the war.
Right, exactly.
I was back in Vietnam for the first time. First time I visited Vietnam was in 98, 99. And I was on an island called Phu Quoc, which was then very undeveloped for tourism. There was just a tiny little place with beach huts. And one of the women who was cleaning the rooms there had an affair with an American soldier and had 2 Amerasian children. And she showed me the letters from him and pictures of her children and told me, what had happened. And, it had been a tough time. I mean, she couldn't get work for a number of years because of
right.
the fact that she had slept with an American. And here was the proof of what she'd done. So
one of the most interesting things that's happened, I think, in these intervening years, and is how America and Vietnam have actually become close, relatively close.
Yeah.
Variety of reasons. How do you assess that? Is it a function of geopolitics? Is it a function of shared culture now that there's so Vietnamese and their descendants in this country? How is that?
Well, I think there's some of that, but of course this is this younger generation. The Vietnamese always were and are incredibly entrepreneurial, hardworking people, and I think this appeals. This is an appealing thing, more so in the North than maybe in the South. But they're known for this, as opposed to the Cambodians and the Laotians and the Thais, who are a bit more casual and sweet and manana. But they're thought to be kind of the Prussians of Southeast Asia.
Yes, exactly.
I think this is, and I think that makes, particularly for Americans doing business now in Vietnam, makes more appealing to people to deal with. And I think there's a historical memory. I think that about the 2 countries. I think there've been a lot of American, of course, retired servicemen who've gone back. Some to live there and others to visit. And there's been a certain level of reconciliation. So I think, certainly there's more interest and I think more traveling between this country and Vietnam as opposed to other nations in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. There's been a lot of increased interaction. I've known more people that have gone there, some of whom are veterans. So that seems to make a lot of sense. And I think I recall even hearing about an American Navy ship that had a Vietnamese American captain that made a call there not too long ago, which was a phenomenal use of soft power, as it were, to say.
He was telling me that a lot, not a lot, but the West Point and the Naval Academy have traditionally had quite a few Vietnamese cadets, and that there is more of a martial tradition in Vietnam and among the Vietnamese than there is in the other Southeast Asian countries.
No, I think that's true. So I mean, as you think about kind of the long-term sort of lessons about this, that this episode, you know, tragic in many respects, but at the end, you know, characterized by heroism. What do you want readers to take away from the book? What is it that you hope they'll recall for you know, about it?
Well, I think the attitude that Americans had then in the 70s towards refugees, which is quite different than the attitude we have today. And one of the reasons for it is simply the historical period in which people had lived through.
Right.
We had lived, even if you were young then, you were living in the shadow of World War II.
Exactly.
And the refugees and people. So there was this feeling that we had a responsibility, you know, that we hadn't taken as many Jewish refugees at the beginning of the war, before we were in the war, as we should have. Then there was this whole business of taking displaced persons from Europe. Then you had the Hungarian, failed Hungarian Revolution, when we suddenly took a bunch of a lot of Hungarian refugees, and then you had the Cuban refugees.
Yep.
So in 1975, we were not that far away from the Cuban, Hungary, and World War II. And so people who were then in their 40s or 50s or 60s, who had fought in World War II, or had been around when these refugee waves had come in, the idea was that this is something the country did. And particularly, we took them as refugees from communism, in the, you know, case of the Cubans and the Hungarians, that they were on our side. They were anti-communists, and this is the same with the Vietnamese too. That these were people who'd thrown their lot in with us, and so that we had a responsibility to them. And now we're that generation who remembers the Cuban exodus and the Hungarian and the displaced persons of World War II has largely passed away, or much older now. So we don't have that kind of national, it's not kind of woven into the national DNA, this idea of opening the country to refugees. I mean, think about it. 6 weeks, 130,000 people come to this country and become American citizens. And then after that, of course, the boat people, we took many, many more throughout the 80s. We took, you know, hundreds of thousands of the boat people.
Yes, exactly.
And I'm not willing, it's not because we have become, you know, more hard of heart or anything. I don't think that's the case. I think it's that we've had different historical experiences. And the people who have grown up saying, what this country does is take in refugees, and people who've been allied with us, we have a responsibility to them. It's not the same, there's not the same historical background anymore.
What's kind of the long-term reaction? I mean, when you sound like you went to Vietnam. I mean, what is their perception now in the aftermath of this, and after all these years of the United States and relations with the United States? Do they, you know, have they kind of, how do they see things now?
Yeah, I'm not an expert. I can't really answer on that. The time I've been to Vietnam twice, the second time I went was five or six years ago. And that was mostly to scope out the kind of physical situation in Saigon. So I described where the docks were, where this was. I went to tow, and I did that. But I didn't really, I didn't announce myself to the government or anything. I was just a tourist, because I don't think they would have liked the idea of someone coming and doing research and writing a book. In fact, I know they wouldn't have, about the anti-communists who'd escaped during the war, at the end of the war. So I don't know. I mean, I had guides, I had interpreters, people were friendly, which is the same thing I had when I went back in the end of the 1990s for the first time. But I didn't enter into any conversations with people about what do you feel is the legacy of the war or something. It's a tricky, I think it's less tricky now than it was in the late 90s when it was, people were still quite
Pressure in people's minds. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Thurston, I first of all want to say thank you for this great conversation. I think this is an excellent book. Again, Honorable Exit: How a Few Brave Americans Risked All to Save Our Vietnamese Allies at the End of the War. I highly recommend it. It's an absorbing read, and it really puts an incredible sort of eye on courage that many of these people had who went back into the country at great risk to themselves, both not just from a career standpoint, but physically, to get these folks out. So thank you, sir, for joining us today. And
thank you, Jay. I want to thank both of you for being on the webinar today. Wonderful conversation. And let me remind everybody that you can pick up a copy, you can order a copy rather, of Honorable Exit from interabangbooks.com, and I hope you'll do that. Let me just quickly remind you about some of the programs that are coming up over the course of the next week or two. Next Thursday, April 16th, we're going to have a program with Robbie Glamour. He's a journalist and reporter for Foreign Policy. It's going to be Diplomacy in the Age of COVID-19. And I'm sure you've seen so many articles like I have that have been addressing just how diplomacy has been shaped or will be reshaped by this, particularly the United States' role with multinational organizations such as the World Health Organization. Then on Friday, April 17th, Jay's wife, Lori, will be having a conversation with Sheila Smith. Sheila is a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and she'll be addressing title of her new book, Japan Rearm: The Politics of Military Power. And then while we were on this webinar, Parag Khanna wrote us, and Parag has agreed to be our guest on April 28th at 5 p.m. Central Daylight Time. I think many of you know Mr. Khanna, and he is the founder of Future Map. And then once again, let me ask you to consider supporting the World Affairs Council in our webinars. You can do that by going to our website, dfwworld.org/donate. Let me wish everyone a very safe weekend. Happy Passover, happy Easter, and we'll see you next Thursday, if not before. Thanks so much for watching.